The old man on the assembly line at Cav Electrics never drew attention to himself. He kept his head down, worked quietly, and spoke only when necessary. During lunch breaks, he sat alone. His English carried a heavy accent, and he never spoke about his past. To his co-workers, he was just another stateless immigrant doing manual labor in post-war Britain. They didn't know that his citizenship had been taken from him by communists. They didn't know his reputation had been quietly destroyed by the British. The hands that now struggled with small, greasy components had once signed operational orders for thousands of airborne troops. The eyes that strained under harsh factory lighting had once studied detailed maps of Europe, weighing terrain, distance, and timing with deadly precision. For nearly 20 years he worked on that assembly line. No pension, no recognition, no one asking questions, just tightening screws, assembling parts, earning barely enough to survive. When he died of heart failure in September 1967, his co-workers attended the funeral out of simple courtesy. They expected a brief, quiet service for a factory worker they barely knew. Then the priest began reading the military record. Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, commander of the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, defender of Warsaw, veteran of the largest airborne operation in military history. The man who warned the British that Operation Market Garden would fail and was ruined for being right. September 12, 1944. An English conference room filled with Allied commanders planning what they believed would be the most ambitious airborne assault ever attempted. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had convinced Eisenhower to approve Operation Market Garden. The plan promised speed, surprise, and a decisive blow. 3 airborne divisions would drop deep behind German lines in the Netherlands, seizing bridges across the Rhine. If successful, Allied armour could race into Germany itself. The war, Montgomery believed, could be over by Christmas. General Roy Urquhart of the British 1st Airborne Division presented the plan with confidence. Sosabowski sat toward the back of the room, silently studying the maps. What he saw alarmed him immediately. The main drop zones were nearly 7 miles from the Arnhem Bridge. To a civilian, 7 miles sounds manageable. A long walk, maybe a morning hike. To an airborne commander, it was an eternity. 7 miles meant time. Time meant exposure. Exposure meant resistance. Paratroopers would lose surprise long before reaching their objective. And there was more. Aircraft shortages meant the landings would be spread across 3 days. 3 days without concentration of force. 3 days without surprise. 3 days for the Germans to react, reinforce, and counterattack. British intelligence insisted the area was lightly defended. Sosabowski knew that assumption was fantasy. Arnhem was the gateway into Germany. The Wehrmacht would defend it with everything they had. When Urquhart finished his briefing and invited questions, Sosabowski wanted to stand up. He wanted to call the plan impossible. He wanted to demand written orders so he would not be blamed for the catastrophe he believed was coming. But he stayed silent. Later, he would admit that he was already unpopular with British commanders. A foreign officer, a Polish general, speaking accented English. Who would listen? That question haunted him for the rest of his life. Earlier warnings Sosabowski had raised concerns before. During planning for Operation Comet, Market Garden's predecessor, he had been direct. He told Lieutenant General Frederick Browning that the mission was essentially suicide. Dropping a single airborne division to capture so many bridges was impossible. Other officers agreed, including Brigadier Hackett. Eventually, Operation Comet was cancelled. But Market Garden was Comet, expanded, more troops, same flawed assumptions. At one planning session, a British officer again presented optimistic assessments. German forces were beaten, demoralized, incapable of serious resistance. Sosabowski interrupted in his deep, accented voice. "But the Germans, General, the Germans." The room went cold. This wasn't just disagreement, it was a violation of etiquette. A foreign officer openly questioning British confidence. You could feel the tension, the shifting in chairs, the exchanged glances, the unspoken agreement that Sosabowski was being difficult simply by refusing to indulge in optimism. He tried to explain calmly, Arnhem was not a minor objective. It was the key to Germany. German armour would respond. Lightly armed paratroopers could not hold against tanks. Drop zones were too far. Staggered landings destroyed surprise. Every concern was dismissed. Browning labelled him a pessimist, a doom thinker who didn't understand Allied momentum. Confidence had replaced caution. What Sosabowski did not know was that a young intelligence officer, Major Brian Urquhart, no relation to the general, had photographic evidence of German tanks near Arnhem. SS panzer divisions were refitting exactly where British paratroopers would land. Browning dismissed that warning as well. The tanks were probably unserviceable, he said, crewed by old men and boys. September 17, 1944. The largest airborne operation in history began, without Sosabowski. His Polish brigade was scheduled to reinforce the British on the third day, but he was not watching events unfold with hope. He was watching with dread. Reports filtered back quickly. The British had landed miles from the bridge, exactly as he had warned. German resistance was far stronger than expected, exactly as he had predicted. Then the weather closed in. On September 19th, fog grounded Sosabowski's aircraft. He sat at the airfield, powerless, while the operation he had warned against collapsed without him. By September 20th, fragments of news painted a grim picture. British paratroopers were surrounded. Only a single battalion held the bridge. German armour was crushing positions never meant to face tanks. Everything Sosabowski had warned about in that briefing room was happening, step by step, and there was nothing he could do except wait for weather that refused to clear. September 21st, 1944. 4 days into an operation planned to last only 2. The weather finally cleared. Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski received permission to fly, but not to the original landing zones. His Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade would be dropped at Driel, on the south bank of the Rhine, opposite the trapped British forces at Arnhem. The danger was immediate. German anti-aircraft fire tore through the transport aircraft. Sosabowski jumped with just 950 men, barely a third of his brigade. The remainder were scattered across English airfields, recalled by weather messages that never reached them. The situation on the ground was already collapsing. The ferry needed to cross the Rhine had been destroyed. British paratroopers were fighting for survival on the north bank. German armour controlled the high ground. Sosabowski had no proper means to reinforce them. Still, his men tried. Under machine gun fire, Polish paratroopers pushed small rubber boats into the river. The boats were fragile, inadequate for the powerful current. The Rhine dragged them off course as flares burst overhead, turning night into daylight. German guns opened fire from the heights. Sosabowski watched from the bank as the river filled with bodies. Roughly 200 Polish soldiers reached the far side. The rest were killed, wounded, or forced back. Everything he had warned about had come true. Now he was watching his men die, proving him right at the worst possible cost. September 24th, 1944. The British perimeter at Oosterbeek was breaking. Sosabowski attended a command conference at the headquarters of the British 43rd Wessex Division. Present were Lieutenant General Horrocks of XXX Corps and other senior officers. Plans were discussed for another nighttime river crossing. 2 battalions would attempt to reinforce the trapped airborne forces. Sosabowski studied the proposed crossing point and felt sick. The location lay directly beneath German positions on the Westerboing Heights. Any troops sent there would be annihilated. He objected immediately. The crossing point was suicidal. He argued that only 2 realistic options remained: a full-scale assault using the entire 43rd Division or an immediate evacuation of the British airborne troops. This limited crossing would achieve nothing except unnecessary deaths. The British commanders were finished with his objections. They did not ask for his approval. They informed him that Polish troops would participate under British command. Sosabowski was furious. His brigade was being committed without his consent to an operation he knew would fail. Horrocks ended the meeting sharply, warning that if Sosabowski refused to comply, another officer would be found who would. The crossing went ahead. It was a disaster, exactly as Sosabowski had predicted. September 25th, 26th, 1944. The order finally came to evacuate. Sosabowski's brigade covered the withdrawal. His men provided rearguard security while the shattered remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division crossed back to safety in darkness. The cost was devastating. Between chaotic drops and the Rhine crossings, nearly 400 Polish soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The brigade was exhausted and bloodied, but it held together. Sosabowski gathered the survivors and prepared to return to England. He had done everything asked of him. His men had fought with discipline and courage under impossible conditions. He expected no praise. He knew how failure was handled. Someone would have to take the blame, and Sosabowski had made himself the obvious choice by being right. October 1944. On October 5th, Sosabowski received a letter from Marshal Montgomery. The letter praised the bravery of the Polish soldiers at Arnhem. Montgomery recommended military decorations for several members of the brigade. The tone was respectful, even gracious. Sosabowski read it with cautious relief. Perhaps the British understood what his men had endured. Perhaps they recognized that the Poles had fulfilled their duty under impossible circumstances. 9 days later, that hope vanished. On October 14th, Montgomery sent a classified letter to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke. The tone was entirely different. Montgomery claimed the Polish parachute brigade had fought poorly. He accused the men of lacking aggression and commitment. It was a complete fabrication, contradicted by after-action reports, eyewitness accounts, and British officers who had fought alongside the Poles. Montgomery recommended removing the brigade from his command. The timing was not accidental. At the same moment, Winston Churchill was meeting with Stalin to negotiate Poland's future. Britain was pressuring the Polish government in exile to accept Soviet demands. Montgomery's accusation weakened Poland's position. Lieutenant General Browning supported the claim. On December 1st, he formally requested Sosabowski's removal, citing the need for a younger, more cooperative officer. The real reason was clear. Sosabowski had questioned the plan. He had been proven right, and that was unforgivable. December 1944. Under intense British pressure, the Polish government in exile had no choice. On Christmas Day, Sosabowski's men learned their commander was being removed. They were devastated. The paratroopers who had followed him through Market Garden began a hunger strike in protest. These were elite soldiers, survivors of one of the war's worst disasters, willing to starve rather than accept the injustice done to their general. Sosabowski intervened. Immediately, he ordered the protest to stop. He refused to let his men suffer for him. On December 9, 1944, the Polish president signed the letter relieving Sosabowski of command. He formally handed over on December 27th. 2 senior officers resigned in protest. The general who had foreseen disaster, who had warned against Market Garden, was reassigned to rear area duties, a humiliating demotion. The scapegoat had been chosen after the war. When the war ended, Sosabowski could not return home. Communist Poland, controlled by the Soviets, regarded him as an enemy. Officers who returned faced imprisonment or worse. In 1946, the communist government stripped him of Polish citizenship. He became stateless. He brought his wife and blind son to London and lived in poverty. He received no British pension, no official support. At age 57, Major General Sosabowski applied for factory work. He found a job at Cav Electrics. For nearly 20 years, he worked on an assembly line. He never spoke about the war. His coworkers never knew. In September 1967, he died quietly. Only at his funeral did the truth emerge. Vindication. Decades later, the truth finally surfaced. In 2006, the Netherlands awarded the Polish Parachute Brigade the Military Order of William. Sosabowski was posthumously honoured. In 2025, 80 years too late, Britain officially acknowledged the courage of Sosabowski and his men. Montgomery received fame in life. Sosabowski received something greater, the judgment of history.